Mississippi River in colonial times.
The Mississippi in colonial times was less a river and more a living thread, a breathing presence that wound across the land in great, slow bends. It was wide, so wide that from one bank the other often seemed like a shadowed line of trees suspended in mist. At dawn, when the first light stretched across the horizon, the river seemed to wake along with the earth itself. The water caught faint streaks of pink and gold, rippling them gently so they broke apart into shimmering fragments. A low fog drifted across its surface, curling like smoke, softening every outline. It was a place both immense and intimate, a wilderness of water, yet close enough that each breath of wind carried its scent of damp earth, wet wood, and wild grasses. For those who lived near it, the river was a heartbeat. Days began and ended with its sound, the deep, steady murmur of current pressing past stones, roots, and sand. Families built their cabins not far from its banks, where the soil grew dark and rich from seasonal floods. Spring brought waters that rose over fields, spreading silt that gleamed almost black when it dried. By summer, corn and beans grew thick and high in that soil, food coaxed into life by the generosity of the river. Autumn carried harvests, wagons rumbling down toward docks where goods could be loaded onto boats. Winter froze the edges but rarely the heart of the Mississippi, leaving its main body moving, stubborn against the cold. A reminder that life itself never truly slept. Boats were the moving villages of this river, though they were small and humble in those days. Some were rafts bound with rope, their surfaces rough but steady. Others were narrow crafts with pointed bows, dugouts carved from the bodies of fallen trees, smoothed just enough to resist the drag of water. Larger flatboats carried heavier loads, barrels of flour bound in iron hoops, kegs of salted pork, bolts of coarse cloth, jugs sealed with wax to keep in cider or molasses. Each creak of timber, each splash of an oar dipping into the water, told of labor done with care and patience. Nothing moved quickly here. The current decided the pace, and those who lived by the river learned to accept its rhythm rather than fight it. The people steering these boats were not adventurers in the way stories often describe, but workers who knew the water as one knows the face of an old friend. Their hands were calloused, their clothes worn, their eyes sharp with the memory of landmarks. A leaning oak at a bend, a cluster of stones where the water ran shallow, a sandy bank where one might pull ashore to rest. Some pushed long poles into the riverbed, guiding their craft steadily forward. Others raised small sails to catch the wind, though the river's breath was often lazy, tugging only enough to sway the cloth like a lullaby. On quiet mornings, when mist blurred the edges of everything, it was easy to believe the boats floated not on water but through a dream. Villages stood like quiet companions along the banks. To approach them from the water was to see smoke rising first, thin columns drifting above treetops, smelling faintly of pine or oak. Then came the shapes of cabins, simple and sturdy, their roofs steep against the weight of rain or snow. Yards stretched down to the water, marked by fences where goats or pigs shuffled about, chickens scratching in dirt, children chasing one another with laughter carried across the still air. A woman might stoop at the bank, filling a clay jar with river water. A man might pause from splitting logs to raise a hand in greeting to a passing boat. These gestures were small, but on the Mississippi, they meant much. Signs of recognition, of kinship in a land that was often vast and lonely. The mornings carried a stillness that softened everything. Mist wrapped the trees, turning them into shadowy towers. Boats drifted with little sound beyond the dip of an oar or the occasional crack of a pole against hidden stone. Travelers often spoke in low voices or not at all, as though words might disturb the quiet spell cast by the river. Sometimes a tune rose instead, a hum, a soft song, simple in melody but full in feeling. The voices carried easily across the water, blending with the current until it seemed the river itself was singing. By midday, the world brightened. Sunlight scattered across the surface, dazzling and restless. Birds wheeled above, their cries sharp and free. The banks came alive with color, grasses bending in the wind, flowers nodding, dragonflies darting like bits of green glass. Boats passed one another, and sometimes men called out, exchanging bits of news, warnings of where snags or sandbars waited, or simple blessings for the journey. These conversations were brief, shouted across distance, yet they carried warmth. On the river, one was never entirely alone. Evening, however, was the hour of rest. As the sun dipped low, shadows grew long, and the water deepened in color, taking on shades of blue and violet. Boats pulled to shore, tied to roots or stakes. Fires were built, their smoke curling upward into the cooling air. The smell of bread warming over coals, of fish laid across hot stones, mingled with the river's own damp breath. People sat on overturned barrels or flat planks, bowls in their hands, voices soft as they spoke of the day the distance traveled, the strength of current, the weather tomorrow might bring. Laughter sometimes rose, sudden and bright, then faded into the steady sound of frogs calling from the reeds. Night turned the Mississippi into another world. Stars unveiled themselves slowly, until the sky was thick with them, endless and silver. The moon stretched its light across the river like a ribbon, shimmering each time the water moved. Boats lay still, their forms dark against the glow. Some travelers lay on their backs, staring upward, letting their thoughts drift with the constellations. Others pulled blankets close and closed their eyes, lulled by the steady hush of current against wood. Owls called from the woods, coyotes cried far away, and still the Mississippi flowed, tireless, ancient, its voice, a deep murmur that seemed to cradle everything in reach. In these colonial days, life was uncertain, the future unclear. Yet the river offered a promise no parchment or speech could give, that tomorrow it would still move, still feed, still carry, still hold. It was not a backdrop to history, but the quiet stage on which countless lives unfolded, a stage of water, mist, firelight, and song. Those who lived by it or upon it understood something wordless, something steady, that while people came and went, the Mississippi endured, patient and unhurried, a witness to every dawn and every silence. As the sun rose higher and the fog dissolved into the warmth of morning, the Mississippi revealed more of its quiet abundance. The river did not hurry, yet it carried with it endless motion, ripples nudging against roots, eddies swirling where fallen branches jutted out, wide stretches where the current looked smooth but held hidden depths. The water was more than a surface. It was a passage, a mirror, a giver of life. Fishermen leaned from their boats with nets woven by hand, dipping them carefully, patient for the tremble that signaled a catch. Sometimes it was only a few silver fish flashing in the sun, scales like coins tossed back by the river. Sometimes the net came up heavy, dripping and alive, enough to feed a family or trade with a neighbor. The river provided in its own time, never more, never less. Children often watched from the banks, their bare feet pressed into mud still cool from night. They tossed pebbles into the water, laughed at the splash, or made small rafts of sticks and leaves to see how far the current would carry them. Their laughter mingled with bird song, the chatter of swallows darting overhead, the long call of cranes rising from the marsh. For them, the river was not commerce or labor but wonder, a playground of flowing mystery, wide and endless, promising both adventure and safety. Homes along the Mississippi were plain, yet each bore its own small signs of care. Doorways swept clean, herbs hung to dry above lintels, chairs carved by hand and set near windows that opened to the river's view. Inside, the air carried scents of wood smoke, boiled grain, sometimes a hint of coffee when a traveler had brought beans from distant ports. These houses were not grand, but they held warmth, and every piece of them seemed to lean toward the water outside, as if the river itself were part of the household. Trade was quiet but constant. Flatboats laden with goods moved between settlements, and now and then larger vessels appeared, sails catching the breeze as they came down from places farther north. These ships carried not only goods but whispers of the wider world, news of distant conflicts, stories of markets bustling in cities unseen, rumors of opportunities beyond the horizon. For many along the Mississippi, such stories remained like clouds drifting overhead, distant, shifting, beyond reach. Their own lives stayed close to the water's edge, where each day was shaped by weather, soil, and the patient rhythm of current. At midday, the heat grew heavier. The air pressed close, thick with moisture rising from the river. Men wiped sweat from their brows, their shirts clinging as they pushed poles against the riverbed to keep their boats aligned. Horses stood tethered in the shade of trees, tails flicking lazily at flies. In the fields, the corn leaves rustled faintly, the sound blending with cicadas humming in relentless chorus. The river itself shone like glass, a wide band of brightness, cutting through the landscape. It offered relief as well as burden, a place to cool weary hands, to drink deeply, to wash away dust and fatigue. Meals were simple and shared. A midday pause might bring families together on porches or shaded patches of grass. Bowls of stew passed around, bread torn by hand. Children sat cross-legged, dipping pieces into thick broth, their mouths stained with berries gathered earlier. Conversation flowed slowly, with long pauses filled by the steady music of the river nearby. No one needed to speak much. The presence of water, of food, of one another, was enough. As the afternoon wore on, shadows lengthened across the banks. Work eased, though never fully stopped. Nets were mended in the shade, tools sharpened, would split for the night's fire. The river carried on with its own endless tasks, branches drifting downstream, sand settling into bars that shifted from season to season, birds swooping low to catch insects dancing above the ripples. A sense of continuity hung over everything, as though time itself moved differently by the Mississippi slower, thicker, stretched out like the bends of the river itself. Travelers stopping at riverside settlements often spoke of this slowness. They came from towns where streets clattered with hoofs, where voices rose in crowded markets, where buildings pressed close. Here, they found space, distance, silence punctuated only by natural sounds. A mug of cider offered by a host tasted stronger in that quiet. A seat by the hearth felt deeper, more restful, because outside the walls the river kept watch, steady and wide. Many left again, bound by duty or ambition, but they carried away an imprint of calm, a memory of how life could flow like water, unhurried, patient, certain. Evening on the Mississippi was its own kind of ceremony. As the sun sank, colors spilled across the sky, pink deepening to orange, orange sliding into purple, purple fading into the soft blue of night. The river reflected all of it, a shifting canvas that seemed alive with light. Families gathered once more, often on porches facing the water. Some held instruments, a fiddle, a flute, a drum tapped softly with calloused fingers. Music drifted out over the surface, mingling with the calls of nightbirds. Fireflies blinked along the banks, their lights echoing the stars beginning to pierce the sky. Children leaned against parents, weary from the day's play. Elders sat quietly, gazing at the river with eyes that remembered many such evenings. Stories were told of floods that had risen higher than rooftops, of winters so sharp the water seemed almost to crack, of journeys made along the current to places beyond sight. These tales were not loud or dramatic. They were steady, recounted with the tone of truth carried across years. The younger ones listened, not always catching every detail, but feeling the weight of memory settle around them like the soft night air. As darkness deepened, lamps were lit inside houses, their glow warm against the dark. Fires crackled in hearths, sending sparks upward through chimneys. The river became darker too, a slow-moving shadow under the moon. Boats anchored close to shore rocked gently, their ropes creaking with the pull of current. Travelers wrapped in blankets lay on planks, drifting into sleep with the lull of water beneath them. Families closed doors against the chill, yet still the river's voice seeped through, that constant, unbroken murmur that was never silence, never noise, but something in between, a companion through every hour. And so each day along the Mississippi unfolded, not with sudden change but with layers of repetition, comfort, and quiet endurance. Life here was not about speed, not about grandeur, but about belonging to land, to water, to the rhythm that bound them together. The river carried goods and people, yes, but more than that, it carried a sense of place, a memory of countless dawns and countless nights. of laughter and labor, of footsteps that came and went, while the water always remained. Night did not come suddenly along the Mississippi. It arrived in layers, as if the river itself drew curtains of shadow across the sky. The last blush of sunset faded into a long twilight, and then stars gathered, scattered first in ones and twos, then in clusters so dense that the heavens seemed to mirror the water below. The wide black current reflected their light, quivering with each ripple, so that the sky appeared doubled, one above, one beneath. To stand on the bank was to feel surrounded, suspended between two infinities, as if the world itself were a boat carried on a cosmic tide. In those hours, voices softened, children already asleep on pallets inside cabins, or curled beneath quilts no longer called to each other. The sounds that filled the air were quieter, the steady chorus of frogs, the occasional splash of a fish leaping after insects, the creak of a tree swaying gently with the evening breeze. Fires burned lower in hearths. Lamps glowed faintly through windows, their light tracing golden rectangles onto the ground outside. For those still awake, the night was not a time for hurry but for reflection, for the kind of silence that steadies the soul. Families sometimes gathered on porches, rocking slowly in chairs, mugs warm in their hands. The drink inside was not always coffee, sometimes cider, sometimes broth, sometimes only hot water infused with herbs gathered from the woods. What mattered was the warmth, the way the steam rose into the cool night and curled briefly before vanishing. People sipped, not speaking often, letting the river provide the evening's voice. Its steady murmur was a reminder that life moved even in stillness, that beneath every pause there was flow. Travelers along the river at night learned to trust this sound. A boat anchored near the shore would sway with the rhythm, its wooden sides knocking gently against poles driven into the mud. Men wrapped in blankets lay under the open sky, their eyes tracing constellations while the current whispered beneath them. Some fell asleep quickly, lulled by exhaustion. Others stayed awake, thoughts drifting as slowly as the water, wondering about distant homes, about journeys yet to come, about the endless path of the river itself. For settlers, the river by night carried memory. Elders remembered earlier days when the banks were wilder, the settlements fewer, the forest pressing closer. They spoke of nights when wolves howled across the dark, their cries echoing in the stillness. Now the howls were rare, pushed back by farms and fires, but the memory lingered. To the young, these stories sounded like legends, half-remembered tales meant to explain the world. To the old, they were truth, reminders of how fragile each clearing, each cabin, each life had once been, and perhaps still was. Moonlight on the Mississippi had a way of reshaping the river. By day, its surface could seem busy with boats, nets, and work. By night, under a silver glow, it became something vast and untouchable. The current gleamed, and in its gleam lay a kind of mystery. Shadows of trees stretched across the water, their branches doubled, swaying above and below at once. Owls glided low, wings silent, eyes catching faint light. Even the air itself felt different, cooler, cleaner, touched with the scent of damp earth and night flowers opening unseen in the grass. Children sometimes dreamed of the river, and their parents said it was no wonder. To grow up beside water so wide, so constant, was to carry it inward. Dreams often placed them adrift on small boats, carried along without effort, guided by stars. When they woke, they carried with them a calmness, as if the night had whispered something only they could hear. Parents, watching their children sleep, found comfort in this, the sense that the river's gentleness touched even the youngest hearts, offering protection that walls and locks could not. Work did not end entirely with daylight. Some tasks belonged to night. Nets set at dusk had to be checked, fish lifted out and sorted by lantern light. Fires needed tending, their embers stirred to keep warmth through the cool hours. Livestock stirred in pens, and someone always listened for signs of trouble, a restless animal, a distant shout, the crack of a branch. Yet even in these duties, the river's presence was felt. It carried sound in strange ways at night, voices echoing farther, oars dipping into water, sounding louder. A man might whisper to a neighbor across the current and hear the reply as if it were spoken beside him. Gatherings sometimes continued past dark, though they were gentle, never loud. A fiddle might play a slow tune, its notes carrying softly across the water. Someone might hum along, another add a line of words, not as a performance but as a comfort, a weaving of sound into the night. Children too small to stay awake curled in their mothers' laps, lulled by music and the steady rocking of chairs. The river absorbed all of it, reflecting not only the starlight but the moods of those who lived along its banks. When storms came, the night changed. Clouds rolled heavy, hiding the stars, and the wind rose, rattling shutters and bending trees. The Mississippi grew restless, its surface broken with sharp waves, logs and debris crashing against one another as they floated downstream. Thunder echoed in long rolls, lightning flashed, revealing for an instant the wild breadth of the water. Families huddled together indoors, candles flickering, prayers murmured. Yet when morning came, the river seemed calm again, as if nothing had disturbed it. Life resumed, fields tended, boats launched, laughter returning. The storm was only another reminder that time here was measured, not in days or hours, but in cycles. Each hardship absorbed, each calm restored. And always, the Mississippi endured. It was the thread that tied each life to another, the steady companion to work, to rest, to birth and passing alike. No single family, no single settlement, no single generation could claim it. It had been before them, and it would remain after them. At night, when silence deepened and stars shimmered, this truth pressed close. To live beside the Mississippi was to belong not just to a place, but to a flow, larger than oneself, a movement that cradled memory, shaped destiny, and offered, above all, a sense of unbroken continuity. Morning often began not with sudden light, but with the slow unveiling of sound. Before the sun rose above the horizon, the river was already awake. A soft mist drifted along its surface, curling in pale ribbons, hiding the far bank so that the water seemed endless. From within that haze came the splash of fish breaking the surface, the call of a bird rising from the reeds, the faint creak of a boat's ropes, stretching with the current. Families inside their cabins stirred at these sounds, as if the river itself were the household's first messenger of the day. The earliest hours belonged to quiet labor. Fires were coaxed back to life from faint embers, sending smoke into the cool dawn. Bread dough, prepared the night before, was placed near the hearth to rise with the new warmth. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes and carried buckets down to the water's edge, filling them carefully, watching the mist shift as if alive. The air smelled of damp wood, earth, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers still heavy with dew. Even before the first meal, life was woven into rhythm with the river. Boats tied at shore rocked gently, waiting. Some carried simple cargo, baskets of corn, bundles of hides, crates of tools. Others held only nets, lines, and the hope of a day's catch. Their hulls bore the marks of long journeys, scratches from shallow waters, stains from tar meant to seal them, ropes frayed by constant use. Yet each was tended with care, for they were lifelines, connecting scattered homes to markets downstream, to neighbors across the current, to worlds wider than the forest and fields. When the sun finally broke through, the river transformed. The mist lifted slowly, revealing the broad sweep of water gleaming gold beneath the morning light. Trees on the far bank appeared, their leaves trembling with brightness, their reflections rippling as if the earth itself bent downward to look into the stream. Birds darted across the open sky, herons gliding low, swallows flashing quick wings, hawks circling high with patient grace. To watch them was to feel the day open, a reminder that the world was larger than any single task, richer than any single plan. Men and women bent to their work, yet even then, the river remained central. Farmers glanced toward its steady current as they planted rows of corn or wheat, knowing that without it, the soil would not be as rich, the fields not as fertile. Traders set out, pushing their boats into the water with long poles, calling softly to one another as they began the slow journey downstream. Fishermen waited in shallow edges, Nets weighted with stones, tossing them in graceful arcs that landed with a muffled splash. Children followed along the bank, laughing, skipping stones, trying to match the rhythm of the water with their play. The Mississippi was not merely resource, it was teacher. It taught patience, for its flow was steady, and no one could rush it. It taught caution, for its depths were hidden, and sandbars shifted from season to season. It taught generosity, for even when storms had stripped fields, or sickness had weakened families, the river still offered fish, still offered passage, still offered its quiet companionship. To live beside it was to learn from it, day after day, in ways too subtle to name but too deep to ignore. Afternoons stretched long, filled with steady work, yet there were pauses. A father resting his back against a tree, hat tilted over his eyes, listening to the lull of water. A mother pausing at the doorway, hands flour-dusted, watching her children chase one another near the bank. A young man standing still, shading his eyes to follow a boat, slipping slowly toward the horizon. These were not wasted moments. They were breaths, woven into the fabric of survival, just as necessary as planting or mending or hunting. As seasons turned, the river showed different faces. In spring, it rose high with meltwater, carrying branches, logs, sometimes entire trees torn from faraway places. Its voice was louder then, rushing, insistent, a reminder of power beneath its calm. In summer, it grew heavy and warm, its banks thick with green, dragonflies hovering in bright swarms above. Autumn brought crisp air, the smell of leaves and smoke, boats heavy with harvest. Winter stilled it, coating edges with ice, slowing its breath but never stopping it. Through each change, families adjusted, their lives braided into the river's endless cycle. Evenings, once again, returned with gentleness. Shadows lengthened, birds quieted, fires flickered to life. Families gathered inside, the day's labors behind them, voices low and steady. Sometimes stories were told, not always of grand events, but of small things, a catch larger than expected, a neighbor's visit, the way the river had looked in early dawn. These stories, though simple, carried weight. They were the threads that stitched days together, that gave meaning to the passing of time. And always, beneath everything, the Mississippi remained. It flowed past laughter and silence, past work and rest, past joy and sorrow. It was too vast to belong to anyone, yet each person who lived beside it felt that it somehow belonged to them, as much a part of family as hearth or field. Children grew into adults with the sound of its current always in their ears. Elders closed their eyes for the last time with its steady murmur still near. It was constant, eternal, a quiet witness to every life it touched. By the close of the colonial day, the river had become more than water. It was memory, promise, presence. To watch it shimmer beneath the moon, to hear it murmur through the dark, was to know that life, no matter how fragile, no matter how brief, was held within something vast, something enduring. And in that knowledge, people found peace, the kind of peace that comes not from triumph but from belonging, from knowing that each life, however small, flowed with the current of something greater, steady, and eternal. Hudson River, a gentle current toward a growing world. The river stretched wide and calm, its surface carrying both light and shadow, as though the sky itself had chosen to rest upon the water. In the early hours, when the mist clung low and pale across the valley, the Hudson seemed less like a river and more like a drifting dream. Shapes of trees softened by fog leaned toward the water, their reflections blurred and trembling, as if they too were unsure where land ended and water began. The stillness was not empty, but alive with hidden murmurs, the faint ripple of fish rising near the bank, the distant call of a bird breaking through the veil of morning, the whisper of reeds stirred by the faintest breeze. Along the shoreline, small settlements began to form, quiet clusters of wooden homes and barns built from timber, taken from the very forests that shadowed them. Smoke rose in thin threads from chimneys, blending with the dawn mist until both were one soft breath upon the horizon. These houses were not grand, but they were steady, rooted like stones at the edge of the water. Their presence a sign of lives beginning to gather here. of families who sought both shelter and promise along the gentle bends of the Hudson. Morning gave way slowly to day. The mist dissolved into a sky brushed with pale blue, and the river revealed its true breadth. The water moved not in haste but with a slow determination, carrying driftwood, carrying leaves, carrying the reflections of clouds that wandered overhead. Small boats appeared, their hulls simple, their sails catching the breeze in quiet arcs. They were not fleets of conquest, nor vessels built for war. They were modest carriers of life itself, fishermen returning with their catch, traders guiding goods across the water, families traveling from one village to another. Their progress was unhurried, their paths drawn not by force but by the rhythm of the current. The river was more than a passage, it was a mirror of the valley it carved, a gentle thread tying together meadows, hills, and forests. Fields stretched back from its banks, freshly plowed or already growing green with crops. The air carried the sense of earth turned by hand, of hay cut and drying in the sun, of wildflowers that leaned close to the water as if listening. The rhythm of work echoed faintly, the thud of an axe in the woods, the creak of a cartwheel on a dirt road, the distant lowing of cattle. Yet all these sounds, no matter how varied, seemed softened by the river's steady hush, woven into a single quiet song of life unfolding along its edges. At midday, the light grew warmer, shimmering across the water like countless coins scattered by the sky. The river seemed to sparkle, yet even in this brightness there was no harshness. Its beauty was patient, lingering, like the slow unfolding of a story told without urgency. Along the banks, children played, skipping stones that leaped in small arcs before surrendering to the current. Their laughter carried over the surface, mingling with the splash of water and the rustle of leaves stirred by summer wind. Nearby, women washed clothes upon flat stones, their motions steady, their voices rising in quiet conversation, sometimes song. The fabric slapped against stone, dipped into the clear current, lifted again to catch the light. It was not labor without weariness, but it was softened by rhythm, by repetition, by the nearness of the river that seemed to steady all hands. As the day turned, boats gathered more frequently upon the water. Some bore baskets of grain, others bundles of furs, others simply carried passengers with little more than bundles of cloth and bread. Each vessel seemed small upon the wide expanse, yet the river gave them purpose, gave them direction. To float upon its surface was to be joined to countless others unseen, to be part of a journey larger than one's own. Even without maps, the current spoke a language that was understood, this way toward the wide ocean, this way toward other towns, this way toward places not yet seen but imagined. The Hudson was not only a road of water, but a keeper of quiet wonder. Travelers often spoke of how the hills rose gently on either side, cloaked in forests that shifted with the seasons. In summer, they stood lush and green, their leaves reflecting light like 1,000 tiny mirrors. In autumn, they burned with gold and crimson, as though the land itself carried its own fire to match the setting sun. In winter, snow folded the slopes in silence, and the river, though still moving, seemed slowed beneath its cold breath. Each season painted the valley in colors, both fleeting and eternal. And those who lived there learned to measure time not only by days but by the river's changing face. Evening came softly, as though the day itself grew weary. Shadows stretched across the water, deepening into blues and violets that shimmered like silk drawn slowly over the land. The air cooled, and smoke once again rose from chimneys, carrying with it the scent of suppers prepared, stews simmering, bread baking, meat roasting. Families gathered in their homes, but the river still held them close. Its steady murmur a reminder just beyond their walls. The boats, too, turned toward shore, their sails folding like tired wings, their oars dipping with a slower rhythm. Lanterns began to glow along the banks, small flames mirrored in the ripples, each one a fragile star laid gently upon the surface of the water. Night upon the Hudson was never silent, yet it was never loud. The frogs and crickets began their chorus, steady and low, as if lulling the river itself to sleep. Occasionally, the call of an owl carried through the valley, or the splash of a fish broke the calm surface. The current, though unseen, never ceased its patient flow, carrying with it the stories of the day, carrying them forward into tomorrow. Those who sat by the river's edge in the quiet hours of night often spoke little. They needed no words. To watch the water was to feel both the vastness of the world and the nearness of home. The river stretched endlessly toward horizons unseen, yet its sound, its presence, folded itself close around every hearth, every bed, every dream. It was both infinite and intimate, both far and near. In its slow breath, people found rest. In its steady movement, they found reassurance that life would go on, that tomorrow would arrive, that time, like water, would always carry them forward. And so the Hudson, in those early days of growth, became more than a river. It became a companion. It watched as homes rose, as children grew, as fields widened, as boats multiplied. It carried grain, it carried news, it carried the weight of hope itself. But it also carried silence, comfort, stillness. It was a reminder that life, no matter how busy, no matter how uncertain, always returned to the same quiet truth, that water flows, seasons turn, and a gentle current will always lead the way toward a growing world. The days along the Hudson did not unfold with sudden change but with quiet persistence, like the slow widening of ripples across still water. Each morning, as the sun rose and brushed the valley with pale light, the river revealed signs of a world that was gently, steadily taking shape. Where once only scattered cabins had stood, more houses now gathered near the banks, built from timber cut and shaped by careful hands. Their walls were rough at first, their roofs thatched or shingled with whatever could be gathered. But each one carried the warmth of fires burning inside, of families who had chosen to root their lives in the soil near the current's edge. These homes clustered together, not from chance, but from need. To live beside the river was to share its gifts, and so people drew closer, forming small lanes and yards where children played, where animals wandered, where neighbors exchanged goods and greetings. Paths worn into the grass became roads, roads that in time would grow firm with cartwheels and the steady passage of feet. The sound of hammers striking wood, of stones set into walls, of laughter drifting across yards blended with the ever-present hush of the river, until the valley seemed to breathe with a rhythm both human and natural. Fields stretched farther back from the water, patched with crops that swayed in the breeze. Wheat and corn grew in steady rows, their green shoots reaching toward the sky. Orchards, young and fragile, began to take root, their blossoms scattering pale petals that floated like small boats across the grass in spring. Cattle grazed in meadows, bordered by wooden fences, their lowing carrying softly through the air. The smell of earth freshly plowed mingled with the sharp sweetness of wildflowers and the faint, cool breath rising from the water. It was a land in the midst of becoming, and the river was its gentle guide. Boats multiplied upon the Hudson, no longer only the humble crafts of fishermen or lone travelers. There now appeared sturdier vessels, flat-bottomed and wide enough to carry bundles of goods. They floated downriver with baskets of grain, hides, and timber, and returned with items less familiar, salt, cloth, tools of iron. Ferries too began to cross the water, carrying not only goods but people, linking one side of the valley to the other. The oars dipped and rose, each stroke steady as a heartbeat, the boat gliding silently, except for the splash and the creak of wood. To step aboard was to feel the current carry you, to see the world tilt and sway, to be reminded that all journeys began with water beneath your feet. The settlements grew, but they grew with a slowness that allowed nature to remain close. Forests still pressed in upon the edges, their branches bending over narrow paths, their trunks standing like pillars of a vast, quiet temple. Birds nested in the eaves of barns, their calls sharp against the hum of insects in summer air. Deer still wandered near the fields at dawn, cautious yet unafraid, pausing to drink from the river's shallows. The people did not yet drive them far, for the valley was wide enough for both. The sound of an axe in the woods was followed by silence, the silence filled by wind and water, as if reminding all that the land itself would remain long after tools had grown dull. In the afternoons, the river carried a different life. The ferries moved more often, their decks filled with men and women, with baskets and barrels, with children clutching at their mothers' skirts as they gazed wide-eyed at the endless shimmer of water. Small boats passed in either direction, their sails catching the sun, their shadows drifting upon the current. Sometimes the wind dropped, and the sails hung limp, and men bent to their oars, pulling with steady strength, their arms glistening with the effort, their movements a rhythm older than memory. Trade was simple, yet it carried promise. A man might return from the ferry with a bolt of cloth dyed in colors unseen before, or with a tool shaped by skilled hands far away. A woman might carry spices in a small pouch, their scents strange and sharp, enough to flavor meals for weeks. Children might receive small trinkets, a comb carved from bone, a whistle of wood, a scrap of ribbon bright against plain clothes. These were not riches in the sense of kings or palaces, but they were treasures enough. Signs that the river connected even the quietest valleys to a larger world. As evening neared, the settlements glowed with the calm of daily life completed. Fires flickered in hearths, and the smell of stews and bread drifted into the twilight. The ferry still moved, carrying late travelers across darkening waters, its lantern swaying at the bow, casting a trembling path of light upon the ripples. Dogs barked in the distance, cows lowed as they were led to stalls, and children's laughter gave way to yawns as stars began to prick the sky. The Hudson, however, did not rest. Its current pressed on, steady and sure, carrying with it both silence and sound. Reflections of lanterns from the houses glimmered on its surface, drifting until they dissolved into shadow. The river seemed to hold the memory of the day, the sound of axes and hammers, of ferry bells, of voices calling across fields, and carry it forward into the night. Those who stood at the water's edge could feel the weight of time moving with the current, slow yet unstoppable, shaping both land and life as gently as it shaped the stones in its bed. In these years of quiet growth, the Hudson became more than scenery. It was the thread from which lives were woven, the path along which goods and stories traveled, the mirror in which people saw both themselves and the wider world. It whispered of change, yet it never hurried. Its patience taught those who lived beside it to build slowly, to plant carefully, to trust that in time, a community would rise as steadily as the current itself. And so, while empires and cities far away surged with noise and ambition, here along the Hudson the pace was different. It was not the roar of sudden triumph but the hush of steady persistence. Each home, each field, each ferry crossing was a note in a larger song, a song that told not of conquest but of belonging. The river sang it best of all, low and constant, flowing ever onward, reminding every listener that life, like water, is strongest not in its rush, but in its quiet endurance. The river was wide, and though it flowed with calmness, it still stood as a boundary between one side and the other. For those who lived along its banks, the crossing became more than necessity. It became a daily rhythm, a reminder that life on one shore was never fully separate from life on the other. And so, ferries multiplied, small wooden craft at first, simple platforms guided by poles or oars, later fitted with sails that caught the valley winds. They moved across the current slowly, their journeys neither rushed nor delayed, carrying with them the steady pulse of community. Each crossing was a small ceremony of patience. A farmer with a cart of vegetables stood beside a fisherman with baskets of his catch. Women carried bundles wrapped in cloth, their faces shaded by bonnets or scarves, while children clutched at skirts or swung their legs restlessly over the side. The ferry rocked gently, the boards creaking, the water lapping at its edges. The ferryman leaned into his work, pushing or rowing, his movements steady, his breath rising and falling like the current itself. Conversations were soft, carried on in murmurs so as not to disturb the hush of the water. Sometimes there was silence, a silence not awkward but companionable, the kind that came when people shared the same horizon, the same gentle drift. The river offered these crossings not only as passage but as meeting places. People who might otherwise remain strangers found themselves shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the far bank to draw near. News traveled across the deck as easily as baskets and barrels. Someone spoke of crops ripening too soon, another of a storm that had swept through the hills. A fisherman told of nets, heavy with unexpected catch, while a traveler from a distant village shared the scent of spices tucked in his pocket. The ferry carried more than booties and goods. It carried voices, stories, and laughter. By the time feet touched land again, those aboard had shared a sliver of life together, however brief, however quiet. From the river's surface, these boats looked like small moving islands. Their shadows stretched and shifted, distorted by the ripples. The sails, when raised, glowed against the sky, catching the gold of late afternoon or the pale silver of dawn. Sometimes a flock of birds wheeled above, their cries mingling with the creak of timbers and the splash of oars. At other times, mist rose from the water and wrapped the ferry in a soft veil, so that passengers could see only the pale outline of the opposite bank. To ride through such mist was to feel as though one floated between two worlds, suspended in a silence deeper than any words. The ferries shaped the rhythm of settlements. Markets grew near the landings, where boats came ashore and travelers stepped onto solid ground. Here, stalls displayed bread still warm from ovens, bolts of homespun cloth, jars of honey, barrels of cider. The hum of barter and exchange rose like a second tide, flowing as steadily as the current. To the people of the valley, the ferry landing was more than commerce. It was gathering, a place where faces became familiar, where nods and greetings wove neighbors into friends. Children ran between stalls, chasing each other while their parents traded, their laughter as bright as bird song above the clamor. Evenings on the river were tender. The ferry still moved, though more slowly now, their lanterns swaying on hooks, casting fragile circles of light that trembled across the dark surface. Passengers huddled close, their cloaks drawn against the cool to ferrymen's, or dipped into water that looked like black glass, each stroke scattering sparks of moonlight. The voices of travelers hushed, subdued by the vast quiet that fell with dusk. A child leaned against a mother's shoulder, half asleep. An old man stared at the stars reflected beneath his feet, as though the heavens had bent down to rest in the river. Crossing at night was not merely travel, it was reverence. A moment when even the most ordinary soul felt the closeness of mystery. With every ferry, the river knitted its valley closer. Families divided by water could visit more often. Goods grown or made on one shore reached the other with ease. Friendships deepened. Kinship widened. The Hudson was not only a river but a bridge, and its ferries were threads in a quiet web of belonging. To live near it was to accept that one's life was always touched by others, by those who rode beside you, who shared a market, who offered a hand to steady your step as the ferry bumped against the landing. There was no grandeur to these crossings. They carried no banners, no declarations, no drums. Their power was in their simplicity, the way they joined what was separate, the way they made neighbors of strangers, the way they reminded each person that the river's strength was not in its width but in its openness. For though the Hudson flowed endlessly toward the sea, its ferries taught that life's most enduring journeys are often short, often quiet, often measured not in miles, but in moments of gentle connection. The ferryman, standing at his post, likely thought little of this. To him it was work, the familiar weight of the pole, the steady ache in his arms, the feel of the current pressing against the hull. Yet he was a keeper of bonds, a silent link in the chain of lives. Each time he guided his craft across, he carried not only people, but the shape of their days, their hopes, their weariness, their hunger, their laughter. When he tied the ferry to the landing, and the passengers stepped ashore, he left behind no mark but ripples spreading outward, fading slowly into the river's endless song. And the river received it all, patient and eternal. The Hudson carried the ferries as gently as it carried driftwood, as steadfastly as it carried fish, as endlessly as it carried the reflection of the sky. It was not hurried, it was not possessive. It gave its surface to every crossing, and in return, it gathered every memory, the creak of boards, the murmur of voices, the echo of laughter that lingered for a breath before dissolving into the current. Thus the ferries became more than craft of wood and rope. They became symbols, almost unnoticed, of what the river itself whispered. That life, when shared, is lighter, and that distance, when crossed together, is not truly distance at all. There were mornings when the river woke more slowly than the town itself. A pale mist would drift above its surface, soft and weightless, curling as if reluctant to leave, from the cottages and wooden houses along the banks. Smoke would rise from small hearth fires, mingling with the damp coolness of the air. The Hudson, in those hours, seemed not a rushing current but a still mirror, a sheet of glass holding the faint colors of dawn. Its quiet presence reminded people that life here did not need to be hurried. The river, steady and patient, would carry them through another day. Families stirred gently into motion. A mother stepped out to sweep her porch, her broom scratching softly against the planks. Children, still rubbing the sleep from their eyes, wandered down to the bank, tossing sticks into the water, watching them float lazily away. These were not grand moments, not things history books would ever note, but they carried the pulse of real life. The Hudson was not a distant landmark. It was part of every breath, every chore, every pause that made up the rhythm of a home. The river was a provider, yes, but also a companion. A fisherman would push off in his small boat, not with urgency, but with a practiced calm. His paddle dipped, rose, and dripped again, each motion blending into the slow beat of the morning. On the opposite bank, another figure could be seen moving through tall grass, carrying a basket or checking traps. From one side to the other, lives unfolded quietly, each gesture connected to the water that lay between. By midday, the river's mood shifted. The mist was gone, the sun lay warm across its back, and ferries began to move with steady purpose. These ferries were lifelines, carrying not only sacks of grain, barrels of cider, and baskets of apples, but also the conversations, greetings, and news that tied people together. A neighbor might step aboard simply to share a few words with someone across the way. A traveler might clutch his hat as he joined the crossing, leaving behind one town's worries for another's possibilities. On deck, chickens sometimes clucked in wooden cages, their restless sounds mixing with the creak of timbers and the low splash of water against the hull. Even these ordinary crossings became part of the shared rhythm, part of what it meant to live beside the Hudson. Afternoons glowed with a clearer light. The sky was often wide and bright, the air carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and earth. Men repaired nets or shaped planks, their tools ringing with small metallic notes that echoed faintly over the water. Women washed clothes at the edges, their hands steady, their voices quiet as they spoke to one another. Children, restless after chores, found corners to play in, skipping stones or chasing after shadows cast by the swaying trees. Through it all, the Hudson moved steadily, holding their reflections in its wide embrace. And then came the evenings, golden and gentle. The sun lowered itself slowly, pouring honey-colored light across the river, setting the water aflame in shades of orange and red. Boats returned one by one, their wakes leaving trails that shimmered for a moment before fading into stillness. Sometimes a worker would hum a tune as he guided his vessel home, the sound barely carrying across the surface, dissolving into the calm. That small song, simple and unremarkable, became a hymn to the day's labors, a lullaby offered to the river itself. After darkness fell, the Hudson took on yet another voice. Lanterns flickered in windows, their reflections trembling on the black water. Along the shore, the faint glow of firelight escaped from open doorways, spilling into the night. Families gathered inside, their conversations rising and falling like waves. Too soft to carry far, yet enough for the river to catch and cradle. The Hudson had no choice but to listen. Every sigh, every laugh, every hush seemed absorbed into its endless current. Nights on the river were not silent, but they were never harsh. The sound of water pressing gently against the banks, the whisper of wind sliding through reeds, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface, these were the sounds of life settling into rest. From time to time, a ferry would cross under the cover of stars, its lantern swaying gently, its deck filled with passengers who spoke little, preferring the company of night itself. Children might fall asleep against a parent's side before the boat even reached the far shore. their breathing blending with the rocking of the water. The Hudson, in all these ways, became something deeper than a body of water. It became a witness. It remembered the footprints in the sand that the tide washed away. It remembered the small quarrels and quiet reconciliations spoken in the dim glow of kitchens. It remembered the weight of baskets, the tug of nets, the touch of tired hands against wooden rails. The river held all of it, keeping safe what might otherwise vanish. When storms rolled in, the Hudson showed another face. Rain hammered against shutters, wind clawed at rooftops, but still families drew close to one another by the fire. In those nights of rattling panes and flickering lamps, the chairs inside the houses felt heavier, more certain, like anchors against the storm. Outside, the river surged and frothed, but inside, the rhythm of human warmth endured. The storm passed, always, and in its wake, the Hudson returned to its quiet song, as if nothing had disturbed it at all. With time, generations grew and passed, yet the Hudson remained. Grandparents, once strong, lowered themselves more carefully into their chairs, their eyes resting on the water with a kind of knowing calm. Children grew into adults, carrying the memory of mornings spent skipping stones, of evenings listening to their parents' voices soften as the fire dimmed. The river was there in each of these memories, unchanging and yet always different. A steady companion to lives that rose and fell like the seasons. To speak of the Hudson, then, is not to tell of grand battles or sudden discoveries. It is to tell of the slow, patient heartbeat of ordinary life, of mornings wrapped in mist, of afternoons spent in labor and laughter, of evenings gilded in light, of nights softened by the river's gentle murmur. This was the history of a people shaped not by monuments but by moments, by the simple presence of water flowing, always flowing, carrying them gently forward. And so, when one stands by the Hudson at dusk, listening as the day drifts away, it becomes clear that history lives not only in books, but in the hush of a river, in the softness of a ferry crossing, in the echo of voices long gone yet somehow still there. The Hudson does not speak loudly, but it does not forget. It remembers, and in remembering, it gives shape to the quiet story of a nation learning, slowly, how to live. The river before time, nature's endless flow. The river has always been there. Long before towns, long before the sound of tools shaping wood or stone. The waters of the Colorado moved through canyons and valleys with a voice that was older than memory itself. Its current was steady, sometimes quiet as a whisper sliding over smooth stones, sometimes rising with the force of 1,000 drums when rains swelled the highlands. To those who lived beside it, the river was not just a path of water. It was a presence, a companion, a slow heartbeat echoing through the land. Morning light would slip across the cliffs, painting the river in gold that shimmered and stretched as far as the eye could follow. Birds wheeled above, their wings catching flashes of sun, their calls drifting downward like greetings to the flowing water. Along the banks, reeds bent in the breeze, their green stalks brushing against one another with soft sighs. The air was often cool at dawn, carrying the smell of earth, of wet stone, of a freshness that belonged only to places touched daily by running water. Those who lived nearby woke with the river. Tents or small dwellings of wood and hide opened to its sound, and the day began with footsteps pressed into damp soil. A child might crouch by the edge, tossing small pebbles into the current just to watch how quickly the water carried them away. A mother might fill a clay vessel, the surface trembling as she lifted it, drops sliding back into the flow. A father might set out nets or lines, not with haste, but with the patience of someone who knew that the river gave in its own time, never rushed, never demanded, only steady. The river's surface was like a mirror, yet it never showed the same reflection twice. Clouds drifted across, reshaping themselves in rippling patterns. The cliffs stood tall above, their colors deepening as the sun climbed, rust red and amber, gray and gold. Sometimes, the water ran clear enough that stones at the bottom shone like small treasures, their smooth faces shaped by centuries of movement. At other times, after storms, the river carried a rich, earthy haze, as if the mountains themselves were lending their colors to the flow. In these early days, there were no bridges, no wide boats, heavy with goods. The river was crossed with caution, sometimes with rafts, sometimes with bare feet, feeling for stones just below the surface. It was respected, always. A single misstep could sweep a body downstream, yet that danger was accepted as part of the river's nature. To live with it was not to control it, but to learn its moods, to understand its voice, to move in harmony rather than in defiance. Evenings were perhaps the most peaceful. When the sun lowered and the cliffs glowed like embers, families gathered near the banks. Fires were lit, their smoke drifting upward in thin trails. Shadows lengthened, stretching across the water like dark fingers. The river reflected both flame and sky, carrying the colors into the distance, as if delivering them to unseen places. Conversations near the fire were soft, often punctuated by long silences where only the water spoke, reminding everyone that life was larger, slower, older than the day's small labors. For those who depended on it, the Colorado was more than resource. It was story. Each bend in its course was remembered, each crossing marked with tale and teaching. Elders would speak of times when animals gathered at its edges, of seasons when the water rose high and fast, of years when it sank low and revealed stones rarely seen. Children listened, wide-eyed, tracing with their fingers in the sand, as if the lines could hold the memory of the words. In this way, the river carried not only water but knowledge, a current of memory flowing from one generation to the next. At night, the river did not fall silent. The sound of its movement became a lullaby, steady, patient, like a breath that never ended. Stars appeared overhead, scattered in countless numbers, their light faint but persistent, mirrored in the dark surface below. The air cooled, carrying the scent of sage and pine, carrying also the faint dampness of mist rising from the water. Families slept knowing that the river watched over them, its rhythm unbroken, its course eternal. The Colorado, in those times, was not yet written into maps or measured by distant hands. It was a living presence, known by those who touched it daily, unnamed but unforgettable. It wound its way through stone and soil, carving paths deeper than any tool could cut, singing in tones no instrument could match. To stand beside it was to stand in the company of something vast, something timeless, something that asked nothing more than to be noticed, to be respected, to be lived with. And so, before history called its name, before settlements rose and steamboats churned, the river flowed. Through dawns and dusks, through seasons of rain and drought, through moments of abundance and moments of want, it carried on. It held the reflections of mountains, the flights of birds, the laughter of children, the wisdom of elders. It was, and it remained a slow, endless voice of the earth itself, whispering through time. Life along the Colorado was never separate from the river itself. To the people who built their homes near its bends and valleys, the water was more than a place to drink or to fish. It was a teacher, a guide, and a living spirit. Each sunrise across the canyon walls reminded them that the river was older than their stories, yet still close enough to touch with bare hands. In the early mornings, families gathered quietly at the edge of the current. The first light touched the cliffs, painting them in deep red and soft orange, and the river glowed with those colors. It was said that offering a thought of gratitude to the water at dawn helped guide the day. Some would lay small bundles of herbs on the surface, watching as the current carried them away, believing the river delivered their prayers to places unseen. Children imitated the elders, dropping tiny pebbles and whispering wishes that only the water would hear. The rhythm of daily life followed the river's seasons. When the waters ran high in spring, swollen by distant rains and melting snow, the banks grew rich with fertile soil. Families planted maize, beans, and squash in neat rows along the edges, careful to respect the flow, careful not to take more than the earth could give. Wooden tools scraped the soil, seeds were pressed gently into place, and the river itself fed the crops with moisture carried through small channels dug by hand. Every sprout that pushed through the earth was a gift, every harvest a reminder that the river nourished both body and spirit. Fishing was both labor and ritual. Nets woven from plant fibers were cast into calm inlets, weighted with smooth stones. The waiting was patient, unhurried, as if time itself moved at the same pace as the current. When fish wriggled against the net, they were lifted with quiet respect. Elders often spoke to the catch, thanking it before carrying it to shore. Fire pits lined with flat stones were set, fish laid out to roast slowly, the smell rising into the air like a gentle offering. Nothing was wasted. Even bones were cleaned and shaped into tools or ornaments, reminders that the river gave in many forms. Beyond food, the river offered paths. Narrow canoes carved from fallen trees slid across the water, guided by long poles. Children sat still in the boats, eyes wide as they felt the sway beneath them, listening to the steady splash of paddles. To travel on the river was to move without leaving footprints, gliding silently through a world of towering cliffs and open skies. The river was both road and companion, carrying people to gatherings, to trade, to the simple joy of drifting downstream beneath the call of birds. The Colorado was also a place of teaching. Elders sat by the banks, tracing shapes in the sand to explain how the stars above mirrored the flow below, how the cycles of the moon followed the rising and falling of the waters. Children listened, their faces lit by firelight, the river behind them murmuring as if confirming every word. Stories told of animals that had once drunk from its shores, of spirits who lived beneath its surface, of ancestors who had followed its path to find their home. These tales were not only entertainment but instruction, weaving memory and wisdom into the fabric of life. Ceremonies often took place by the water's edge. When the moon was full, fires reflected on the surface, glowing twin flames in the dark. Drums echoed softly against the cliffs, blending with the river's eternal rhythm. Voices rose in chant, low and steady, as if answering the current itself. Some dancers painted their faces with clay, their movements slow, their feet pressing patterns into the earth. The sound of rattles joined the night air, mixing with the hiss of reeds swaying along the banks. These gatherings were not for spectacle but for balance, to keep harmony between people, river, and sky. Seasons brought change, and the people adapted with patience. In summer, when heat pressed against the land, the river offered cool relief. Children splashed in the shallows, laughter carried downstream, their shadows broken into ripples. Families rested in the shade of cottonwood trees, the leaves whispering in the warm wind. In autumn, when the air grew sharp and the crops were gathered, the river slowed, its voice lower, as if settling into rest. Winter brought silence. Ice clung to the edges, thin and clear, while smoke curled from dwellings set back from the water. Yet even in cold, the river moved, steady, faithful, a reminder that life continued beneath the surface. The people did not think of themselves as separate from this cycle. They were not masters of the river, nor servants. They were part of the same breath, the same rhythm. To them, the Colorado was not a thing to be owned or divided, but a presence to be honored. It taught patience, it taught humility, it taught the simple truth that survival and joy both flowed from the same source. At night, when all grew quiet, families lay within their shelters, listening to the steady song outside. The stars glittered in countless numbers above, the cliffs standing tall and watchful. Children fell asleep with the sound of water in their ears, dreaming of currents carrying them to far-off places. Elders closed their eyes knowing the river would still be there in the morning, flowing as it always had, flowing as it always would. And so, life beside the Colorado was not a story of conquest or wealth. It was a story of belonging. Each day was marked by the water's movement, each season guided by its rise and fall, each generation connected through its endless flow. It was more than a river. It was home. The Colorado did not flow alone. It carried with it the presence of the land, wide, vast, and sometimes fierce, sometimes tender. To walk its banks was to step into a world where stone and sky seemed larger than any single life. Yet where every detail mattered, the curve of a canyon wall, the shadow of a bird circling high above, the sudden bloom of flowers after a rare rain. The cliffs rose on either side, carved by ages of patient water. Their surfaces bore layers of color, deep reds and ochres, pale tans, and streaks of gray. Each band a memory older than memory itself. When the sun moved across the sky, those walls shifted in tone, glowing bright at midday, softening into rose and violet at dusk. In morning light, they were cold and silent. In evening, they seemed to breathe warmth back to the earth. Travelers along the river often paused not to rest, but simply to watch the play of shadows moving like slow dancers across the canyon's face. The air carried many voices. Wind brushed across the cliffs, whistling low in narrow passages. In open spaces, it rushed in great sweeps, lifting dust into spirals that shimmered in the sun. The river itself added its own steady murmur, sometimes rushing, sometimes whispering, always present. Together, wind and water created a music without end, a song that needed no words. Those who listened closely felt both small and protected, as if they had stepped into a cathedral not built by hands but by time itself. Animals moved with quiet dignity in this world. Along the water's edge, deer bent their necks to drink, their ears twitching at the faintest sound. Rabbits darted through brush, leaving only trembling stems to mark their path. Birds filled the sky with effortless motion, hawks circling high, swallows darting low, herons gliding just above the surface, with wings outstretched like open sails. Now and then, the sudden cry of an eagle echoed through the canyon, a sound that seemed to belong as much to stone as to sky. At night, coyotes called across the valley, their voices rising and falling like distant conversation, answered sometimes by the soft hoot of an owl. The land itself shifted with the seasons. In spring, wildflowers spread in patches across sandy soil, flashes of yellow and purple breaking through the dry earth. By summer, heat pressed heavy, and the ground cracked in thin lines. But cactus bloomed all the same, their blossoms sharp against the pale desert. Autumn painted shrubs in deeper tones, their leaves crisping at the edges. Winter brought a different stillness. Frost clung to stones, and the river carried ice along its shallows, the canyon walls echoing with a sharper, colder silence. There was beauty in the smallest things. Smooth pebbles lined the shore, polished by countless years of current. Reed grasses swayed gently in the breeze, catching light on their slender blades. In quiet pools where the river slowed, dragonflies skimmed the surface, their wings glinting like shards of glass. Even the sand carried wonder, shifting with every step, recording prints of animals, erasing them again with the next wind. Nothing remained still for long. Everything changed, yet everything felt eternal. The sky above was never just background. By day, it stretched vast and open, a dome of blue so wide it made the river seem like a thin thread of life winding through endless space. Clouds moved in slow herds, their shadows crawling across the land. By night, the stars appeared in such number that they seemed to spill down toward the cliffs, as if trying to touch the earth. The Milky Way arched bright and clear, mirrored faintly in the dark surface of the river. People sitting by their fires often fell silent, not from sleepiness alone but from awe, from the feeling of being part of something far larger than the self. Storms brought drama. Lightning flashed against canyon walls, illuminating them in bursts of silver fire. Thunder rolled, deep and heavy, echoing between cliffs like drums. Rain fell hard, striking stone, filling gullies that moments before had been dry. Yet, as quickly as they came, the storms would pass, leaving the air washed clean. The river swollen with new life, the land glistening as if freshly made. Afterward, rainbows sometimes appeared, stretched like bridges between cliff tops, fleeting yet unforgettable. For those who lived there, the land was not empty. It was alive with presence. Every rock carried story, every tree carried shade, every animal carried meaning. The people did not divide themselves from it, they saw themselves as part of the same circle. To walk a trail along the river was to walk in company, even if no other person was in sight. The cliffs stood like ancient guardians. The river moved like a wise friend. The animals gave their signs, the sky gave its moods, and the earth gave its quiet strength beneath each step. Even silence was never empty. It carried the hush of wings, the sigh of water, the weight of stone. Sitting on a ledge above the current, One could feel time stretching both backward and forward, as if the cliffs remembered everything and would remember long after. That stillness did not demand words. It asked only for listening, for being, for breathing in rhythm with the land. And so the Colorado was more than water. It was a whole world, cliffs, sky, animals, winds, and silence woven together. Those who paused to notice found peace there. Not in comfort alone, but in the deep reassurance that life, in all its forms, had a place. To live beside such a river was to belong not just to a family or a people, but to the earth itself. The Colorado, winding through its canyons and plains, was never only a river. To those who lived beside it, to those who journeyed along its banks, or paused in its shade, it became something deeper, a mirror of life itself, holding both stillness and motion, both past and future within its current. Its waters carried not just earth and stone but memory, memory of storms long vanished, of footsteps worn into trails, of voices once lifted in song and laughter. The river's flow was patient. It never hurried, yet it never stopped. Generation after generation could stand at the same bend, listening to the same murmur of water against rock, watching the same swirls gather in eddies, feeling the same cool mist rise where rapids struck stone. Children grew into adults beside its edge, their lives shifting, their houses changing, but the river remained, both constant and ever new. In its presence, people sensed that life was not measured only in single days but in a long, gentle rhythm that connected them to all who came before, and all who would follow. When a child splashed along the shallows, their laughter carried on the breeze. The river seemed to echo it, folding it into its song. When elders sat on flat stones, leaning on their walking sticks, their eyes reflecting the shimmer of water, the river seemed to remember with them, as though the ripples held their stories. It was a companion not bound by age, not bound by time. It was as old as mountains, yet as fresh as morning rain. The land around it listened, trees leaned closer, their roots drinking from its edge. Birds followed its winding path, resting in its shade, nesting in reeds. Deer came to drink, foxes crossed where stones broke the surface, fish darted beneath the mirrored sky. Life gathered here, drawn as much by the spirit of the river as by its water. It was a meeting place where the world itself seemed to pause and share breath. Seasons changed, but the river always knew how to belong to each. In spring, it welcomed the thaw, carrying melted snow from distant peaks, its voice louder, brighter, a herald of growth. In summer, it cooled the heat, a ribbon of relief cutting through scorched land. In autumn, leaves fell into its flow, spinning in golden circles before sinking gently into the current. In winter, ice traced delicate edges along its banks, and the river slowed, hushed, yet still moving beneath the frozen skin. It taught that change was not an ending, but a turning, that all things flowed forward. At dusk, when the cliffs glowed red and shadows stretched long, the river seemed to carry the light itself, scattering reflections across its ripples. Fires flickered on the banks, families gathering close, their voices low, their songs quiet. The river listened, holding the glow of flame, the sound of human warmth, as carefully as it held stars at midnight. Under the vast, endless sky, the current whispered the same truth it always had, that nothing is ever truly lost. Everything flows onward, carried gently, carried surely. There were days when storms came, when floods rose, when the river reminded people of its power. It could carve stone, uproot trees, sweep away the careless, but even then, it was not cruel. It was the voice of the earth itself, reminding all who depended on it that life was never given lightly, never to be taken without respect. To live by the river was to live in balance, to take, but also to give, to build, but also to listen. For those who paused along its banks, there was often a moment when the world felt perfectly still, a heron standing motionless in shallow water, a stone worn smooth by centuries of flow, a reflection of the moon rippling gently across the surface. In those moments, the river revealed its greatest gift, presence. It reminded hearts that being alive was not always about moving faster, reaching farther, doing more. Sometimes it was about sitting quietly, feeling water move past, breathing in time with the earth. And so the Colorado was not just a river to map or measure. It was a thread in the great fabric of life, binding generations, binding land and sky, binding silence and song. Those who walked away from it carried something unseen with them, a calmness, a patience, a sense of belonging that could not be taken. The river gave no speeches, no instructions. It gave only itself, flowing, steady, eternal. Even now, long after those early days, the Colorado carries the same promise. Its waters still move, its canyons still echo, its presence still holds those who come close. To sit by it is to sit with time itself, to know that while lives change, voices fade, and houses crumble, the river remains. A gentle guardian, a keeper of memory, a guide into all the tomorrows still to come.